So, welcome to Jewish culture in Sweden, Judisk kultur i Sverige, and a special welcome to our guest tonight, Adam Gopnik. And together we will discuss the state of democracy in general, and more specifically, the state of democracy in the United States. Adam Gopnik is the author of several books and an award-winning journalist. He has been writing in the New Yorker since 1986, I think it is. And is the recipient of the National Magazine and George Polk Awards, as well as a medal Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters by the French Republic. And last week, he was awarded the Légion d'honneur in France by President Macron. Judisk kultur i Sverige hosted Adam in Stockholm at the International Symposium Jewish in New York, and at the homage program to Philip Roth, where he was the keynote, both was in 2018. And my name is Per Svensson, and I'm a staff writer with Dagens Nyheter. So once again, welcome, Adam.
It's wonderful to be back virtually in Stockholm. I've had such extraordinary times. I've never had a greater honor than the chance to keynote the tribute to Philip Roth, a great writer and a dear friend. So I wish I was in Stockholm physically, but I will accept being there virtually until the world restores some kind of sanity, which I guess is our subject today.
Yeah, and it's you're in New York and it's lunchtime.
I am in New York. I'm in my little writing studio, and where I have been locked up since last March. Not just in the studio. There's an apartment outside it, but and it is lunchtime in New York. I hope that because New York is New York, even at the height of the pandemic, there is construction going on. So they're building a new apartment building next door. So I hope it doesn't. I hope it doesn't interfere with our conversation too much.
No, I think we'll cope. I think we'll cope.
It will provide local color. It will provide New York atmosphere. The sounds of banging and buzzing, and it's nice to know that it still goes on.
Yeah, and it's the day before the inauguration of Joe Biden in Washington, D.C. So I would just start with asking you, what's your feeling about that?
Well, I'm of a temperament that I just want to get there. I'm still, we're 24 hours away. And Trump, it's like a Batman movie, the Trump years, right? It's, the basic structure of a screenplay in a scary movie is that the villain never goes away. Every time you think that the Joker or Bane is vanquished, he appears again to explode an atomic bomb in the sewer system. And I think we all have a bit of that feeling about Trump, that though the story seems finished, it won't be finished until Batman, to mix the metaphor, drives a stake through the heart of the Joker. And though I'm being facetious, I'm also serious about it. I anticipated and I wrote that his defeat in the election was not going to be the end of Trumpism. And we've been through 4 horrific months of lies, culminating in the insurrection at the Capitol, which is properly called an act of domestic terrorism, unimaginably incited by the president of the country. It's one of those things that happens, Paris, that we become so quickly acclimatized to the last atrocity that we then sort of nod and take it for granted. We say, oh yes, and so then the president incited a riot designed to lynch his own vice president for not doing his bidding in overturning a democratic election. And we say, yeah, that happened. And so the accumulation of the unthinkable has been part of these last 4 years. I'm of my last book was called 1,000 Small Sanities, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism. And to use the current verb, I identify as a liberal not in the French sense of a free marketeer, but in the 19th century British sense of being a disciple of John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, and the history of liberalism in that sense. And one of the things that's true about that tradition is that we tend to emphasize the ameliorative over the utopian. We tend to talk more about preventing the worst things from happening than we talk about engineering an ideal world. So in that context, the very fact of Biden taking office is nu, as we say at Passover. That's would be enough for us, just being able to come to an end of this 4 horrific years and replace them with something that approaches a degree of sanity. I say that as a preface. Forgive me, Per. I'm answering a simple question at great length because, of course, part of the structure of the occasion is that many progressives are already disappointed by what Biden has not done, even though he has not yet been in power for a minute. But there's a sense of uncertainty and skepticism about whether he can make the kinds of progressive reforms that the country obviously needs, particularly in the context of this horrific pandemic, which is only getting worse, tragically, rather than better. But as I say, I'm a meliorist rather than a utopian. And I think just the fact of having a sane, normal human being in power trying to do the same normal job of a leader, Dayenu, that's enough for now.
You have your book behind you, and I would love to.
Shameless self-advertiser.
And we'd love to return to it, but I would stay with the inauguration for just a moment.
Sure.
You've seen the press photos from the preparations, and they are in stark contrast to the images that one has of the inauguration 2017 when Trump moved into the White House. I do remember a parade then, and Trump and his family was walking and waving in the streets. And tomorrow there will be no parade, and the ceremony is held at the Capitol that resembles more an army camp in a war zone with the barbed wires and armed soldiers in uniform and so forth. Is this a relevant metaphor, do you think, for American democracy right now, this being on the siege, so to speak?
Yes, obviously American democracy is in battle. I mean, the truth is, hard truth for Americans to accept is that we have not had a peaceful transition of power. Americans boast about our history of peaceful transitions of power. I might add, every democratic country has peaceful transitions of power. We have more difficulty with it than most people. You know, the transition of power in my home country of Canada takes place overnight. One prime minister vacates the prime minister's residence on Stormont Drive, and the next one moves in. The same thing is true at 10 Downing Street. I'm sure the same thing is true in Sweden. Presumably in Sweden, they bike to the presidential palace rather to the prime minister's residence. So there is no prime minister's residence. But that's a norm in a democratic society. And Americans, as you know, tend to be terribly narcissistic, and we tend to fetishize our own democratic accomplishments as though they're unique in the world. In fact, what's striking is how retardataire, how backward American democracy is in that way. But yes, we have not had a peaceful transition of power. We had a violent attempt at a coup to overturn the results. Americans don't want to say that, but that's the reality. And in a certain sense, the coup is not yet over. Trump is not going to be at the inauguration. He's going to have some kind of grotesque self-celebration. And I fully expect that he will announce that he won the election, that he's the legitimate president, that he'll go into exile, but that he is still the rightful president. So yes, in that sense, it's the imagery of barbed wire and soldiers and rifles and so on is true. The only thing I'd add to it, Per, is that this bizarre thing happens on the part of the worst elements of the American right wing, which is to say, we're going to come and kill you. And then he said, well, we'll protect ourselves. And they say, oh, you see, you're embattled, right? So that the reason that those things are happening is not the fault of Joe Biden, it's the fault of Donald Trump. We have a militarized inauguration, not because we're a desperately polarized country with both sides at war with each other, but because of things that Donald Trump did. I don't mean to sound narrowly partisan, Per, because I'm not a particularly ideological leftist, certainly, but I do think that it's important to cut through the bull about, what says, America is a desperately polarized country with two armed and opposing camps. No, it isn't. It has one normal political party, which stretches from the center to the left and to the right, which is committed to democratic institutions, which is flawed and incompetent and all the things that democratic parties are throughout the world. There's one normal democratic party, and then it has an authoritarian right wing. We can debate whether fascist is a fair word or not a helpful word, but it has a right-wing authoritarian party like the National Front in France or any number of other far-right parties in Europe. which is opposed to democratic means and measures. That's the reality. And just to add to that, because I think it's an important point for people in Europe to remember, is that this is not like the 1930s in the late 20s and 30s in Germany, where armed camps representing the left and right went to war in the streets of Berlin and other German cities. The violence, and there was some, let's not deny it, over the summer in cities like Portland and Seattle, there was anarchist, left-wing, Antifa violence. But those people hate Joe Biden and the Democrats much more than they hate Donald Trump and the Republicans. Those are far left kind of punk anarchists, and their number one villain is Joe Biden. Whereas the right wing, the violent right wingers who we saw in action last week, worship Donald Trump. This is not a symmetrical situation in any way. And I think we betray the reality if we pretend that it is.
Why do you think that the word polarization is always used to describe the situation in USA, not least in Sweden? Because you hear it all the time in the news reports and so on, that the USA is more polarized than ever and so forth. And you come to think of some chemistry more than a complicated society. We have acids on one side and the bases on the other one side, like in the chemistry. Why do you think this concept is so popular, has been so widely spread and widely used, polarization?
Well, it's a good question. I think obviously, one hand, because the United States is divided, politically divided, and it has, grave divides. But what's going on is not a symmetrical polarization. What's going on is that you have the majority of the country clearly in one place, and then a very traumatized, revanchist minority who cannot accept the will of the majority. Remember, and it can't be said too often, Donald Trump lost 2 elections by more than 12 million votes or 10 million votes cumulatively. Donald Trump has never had a democratic mandate in any meaningful sense. One of the things that the United States suffers from, and it would be the first in my list of reforms, is a terrible democratic deficit. We have a very antiquated 18th century electoral system, which ranges from, not to get too deep in the weeds, from the way the United States Senate is wildly unrepresentative to the way that the Electoral College, which is in some ways the source of all of our ills in the last while, is equally unrepresentative, to the absurdity of having this 4-month transition period, which is a relic of the era of coaches and horses, when it was difficult to get from Boston to Philadelphia for an inauguration. So we have all of these antiquated democratic deficits that we need to fix. It's kind of the first thing that we need to fix in some ways. So as a consequence, we get a very warped picture of the American reality. The American reality is that the overwhelming majority in this last election, 7 million of an electoral edge of 7 million voters, accepts modernity, accepts change, diversity, equality of men and women, the emancipation of minorities, the transformation from a white majority Christian accented Christian bent country to a different kind of country. That's what Obama represented, and what those of us on that side were too. And this is a fair critique of the American left or the American liberals, is that in our complacency, we did not understand that a figure like Obama, who seemed to us to be so temporizing, mild, centrist, rational, was a terrifying figure to a significant part of the country, particularly in the rural parts of the country, because more than anything else, this division is between urban and rural, and it's between the educated and the uneducated in plain English. So we didn't understand fully how threatening the Obama example was to people, and that's why. And again, this can't be said too often. Trump came to political attention not because he was the voice of the dispossessed, not because he was speaking for people who had lost their employment and their jobs through the decline of manufacturing, all real things. He came to public attention by saying that Barack Obama was not an American, the birther conspiracy theory. He had a conspiracy theory that he subscribed to, probably cynically, that said Barack Obama is not an American. If you hate Barack Obama, you're right, because he's not really an American. That's the emotional, ideological, if you like, mainspring of Trumpism. So, sorry, go ahead.
What was it that was so threatening with Obama? What was it? What he said or did, or what it was? He was. Was it the person Obama or
it was what
the politician
Obama?
You
could not. No sane person could look at Obama or listen to Obama and see anything except the model of a rational, to use a word that I don't like, a centrist politician. I don't like centrist parents, one of the themes of my book, because it implies people who are always trying to split the difference between left and right. Whereas to my mind, the one of the core ideas of liberal democracy is that we end up in the center because it's the one place everyone can get to. It's not that we think that there's all the virtue is in the center, but that from the right, from the left, from every part of the village, everyone can come to the agora in the classical Greek terms. Everyone can come to the piazza. Everyone can end in the center, even if the center is not necessarily the repository of virtue. It's a place of conciliation rather than a place of ideological rigor.
The place of compromise.
Yes, exactly. When compromise in liberalism is not a dirty word, it's a glowing word. It means that you've been able to solve a social problem without violence. It's a knot tied tight between two competing decencies, between two competing visions. And Obama was all of those things. He was those things overtly, things that he said, and he was those things, I don't know what the right word is, imagistically, iconographically, if you like. I'm an art historian by training, so I fall into those words in the way he presented himself, in the extreme middle-class normalcy of his marriage, his relationship to his children, his relationship to his dog. He was an icon of American normalcy and happened to be an African-American, happened to be a Black man. And one of the bizarre ironies of these last 4 years is that Donald Trump, who became the vanguard, the tribune of the dispossessed Christian white, had none of their cultural traits. He was a leader of a cultural backlash who shared absolutely none of the cultural values that his followers possessed. Not a Christian, aggressively not, a man who had been married 3 times, that had countless other liaisons, a man who had no relationship with his children, a man, and in the American scheme of things, this is a big deal, who had never owned a dog, who was so locked inside his own narcissism that he couldn't even empathize with a pet. And yet he became the tribune of the revanchist right. I should add, I think that's important. And I also think, to broaden the lens and the view a little bit, that's also extremely typical. If you look at the history of fascist, right-wing authoritarian leaders, they tend not to come from the group that they represent. They tend to be outsiders who take on themselves all of the suffering, all of the anger of the group. To use the most familiar but appropriate example, Hitler is the tribune of Germany, but he comes from Austria. He's not actually a German in that sense. And we could duplicate these things endlessly. And it's always tricky comparing anyone to Hitler for all the reasons we know, but it's a valuable example because it captures in such glaring, clear terms, the chemistry of right-wing authoritarianism. And there again, you have Hitler, who has no Aryan characteristics at all, who's a small man who looks like Charlie Chaplin, can be pictorialized by his following as though he were a Teutonic knight in armor. And similarly, Trump, who is a morbidly obese, decadent, out of shape, old man, is pictured, if you saw the banners of the people who stormed the Capitol, they have banners with Trump dressed as Captain America, with biceps and a physique, and looking nothing like Donald Trump. but it's clear that part of the psychopathology of fascism, authoritarianism, is that the leader is a source, is a screen on whom you can project what you imagine are the threatened values and virtues of your group. So the psychopathology of Trump and his followers is very complicated. But the basic reality is that they were always a minority. They are still a minority. They've been rejected democratically again and again, but they won't accept the rejection. That's the crisis that we're in.
I think that's interesting what you just said. And I read one of your pieces where you called Trump Tower in New York for the Barad-dûr of Glitz, and Barad-dûr being the fortress of the evil Sauron, the ruler of Mordor in the Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
And as you said, after all, Trump is a New Yorker. And you have just explained it, but it's fascinating that he's worshipped by people that hate everything New York stands for, I guess, including your magazine, I guess.
Yes, but this is interesting, right? Because, and I know that this is the kind of novelistic detail that can seem extraneous at a time of national emergency, but I think it's significant. Part of the reason that Trump's followers, with whom he seems to have nothing in common, can identify with him is that they share a sense of grievance. They share a sense of having been cheated in some way, having been, as we say, disrespected. And what's interesting about Trump is that though outside New York, he's seen as a New Yorker, a billionaire real estate tycoon, within New York and within New York society, it's a crucial point, he was always completely rejected because the genuine billionaire class in New York, particularly the real estate, it's a famous thing. There are 5 great real estate families in New York. They had complete contempt for him. They understood that he was a con man. They understood that he had never actually built anything, that he had just used his father's money to put his name on buildings other people built. So those famous families, the Spires and the Dursts and so on, had complete contempt for him, which he knew. And Trump, as a consequence, I know this sounds, as I say, like a detail, but it's a significant one, was never on the board of any of the great New York philanthropic institutions, the libraries, the museums, never played any role, partly because he was too cheap. So he understood that he had been rejected by the society, the New York society, in which he wanted to project himself. And that was, I think, part of his burning sense of grievance, which he communicates at every moment. He communicates unhappiness all the time. He communicates his emotional tone is always aggrieved and unhappy and angry. And that emotional tone, which, as I say, came out of Trump's own peculiar feeling of rejection by the parts of New York he wanted to belong to, he's able to project out onto his following, which has no idea about the complexities of New York society. But that kinship, that twinship in grievance is a large part of the, as I say, of the psychopathology of that join, of that relation.
As we said, you were the keynote speaker at the Philip Roth seminar in Stockholm, and Philip Roth wrote this dystopian novel called The Plot Against America. Do you think that we actually witnessed a plot against America, during this last couple of years, and not least the last couple of months and days?
Yes, well, I thought part of the brilliance of Philip's book was that he asked the unaskable question. He said, well, what if Charles Lindbergh had been elected president in 1940? The United States has had demagogic right-wing nationalist figures as long as it's been there. And yet at every crucial moment, we had somehow missed the worst. Huey Long, not a name probably that many people know, but was a hugely popular populist leader in the 1930s, was perceived as a Trump-like figure at the time, was assassinated before he could run for president. Charles Lindbergh, similarly, hugely popular right-wing nationalist, allied to Hitler, as Roth shows, again, was politically defeated. Similarly, Joe McCarthy, Barry Goldwater, we could go on and on. So Trump, in a sense, was the bullet in the gun we put to our head that finally went off against everyone's expectations. I think, you know, the last dinner I had with Philip, we were talking jokingly about what could be done about Trump. And my daughter, who was 18 then, came up with an idea that Philip would be able to pretend that he was a Trump supporter so that he could be alone with Trump at a crucial moment. We called it the plot for America. You know, I think that that the lesson, I think that you know, Philip was a great novelist, and novelists don't deal in neat moral lessons. They deal in ambiguity and possibility and so on. But I think one of the lessons that Philip wanted to bring home is that specter of American fascism was always present in the fabric of our country, and that we've kidded ourselves if we didn't see that. The big question, Per, is have we somehow saved ourselves at the last moment again, or is you know, is Biden the Kerensky of America, and you know, the weak Democratic leader who's the last weak bulwark against the coming storm? That's the
that was actually my next question. There's another novel, another dystopian novel, Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here. It describes a fascist United States. So my question was, could Trumpism survive without Trump? Could it actually happen after Trump?
It's a big question.
The American democracy turn into something even nastier than the Trump era?
Totally. Just a literary note, but one that's dear to my heart. You know, Sinclair Lewis, whose novel It Can't Happen Here is a prescient, written in the 1930s about the possibility of American fascism. As you know well, he was the first American to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and was an enormous figure in his time because he wrote social novels about the political and class fabric of American life, Babbitt and Arrowsmith and Main Street. And then he got pushed aside by the modernist novel, by Hemingway, by Faulkner, and so on, and his reputation sank very low. And one of the things that Philip Roth was enthusiastic about towards the end of his life was reviving the reputation of Sinclair Lewis and of that tradition of the self-consciously social political novel, like The Plot Against America, like American Pastoral. So you're raising Sinclair Lewis right after Philip Roth is a you know, powerful additive, you know, a powerful connection. So you know, it'd be worth reviewing. You know, as I say, Lewis was the first American to win the Nobel Prize. His reputation has grown, I think, in the last 10 years. In any case, can Trumpism survive without Trump? Obviously, look, the vein of right-wing authoritarianism rooted in a profound sense of white ethnic grievance. And that, you know, as I said before, we go back and forth. Is it helpful to call Trump and Trumpism a form of fascism? And obviously, in one way, it isn't, because it just sounds like name calling. You know, it's like it's in an undergraduate thing. Oh, you're a fascist, right? And it's not helpful necessarily. At the same time, there is a very, very powerful strain, a vein of, it's not even ideology, a sort of, as I said before, psychopathology, political psychopathology in the last 150 years, which involves, you know, a checklist of attributes: profound sense of ethnic grievance, a conspiratorial certainty that there's an outside group, Jews or Muslims or Mexicans, who are responsible for your grievance, a hatred of educated elites, an obsessive hatred of educated elites, usually propelled by the people who feel themselves to be educated but rejected, like the people who surround Trump, and so on. And boy, when you go down that checklist, it's Trumpism. You know, I'm hopeful that, as I said before, Trumpism is a popular movement, but it's never been a majority movement. It's never been a majoritarian movement. It's always been a minority. We cannot say too often that Trump is the most unpopular president of modern times, by far, that he lost the vote. We call it the popular vote, which is crazy. It's the vote. He lost the vote by a significant margin in 2 elections, by an enormous margin in the last election, that in the most prosperous and innovative parts of the country, New York on the East Coast, California on the West Coast, he's not just unpopular, he's he's toxically unpopular. He can barely get 30% of the vote in those places. So we shouldn't exaggerate Trump's power or popularity. It really resides in the American South and in the American rural Midwest, where there's always been that potential. So I don't think we should exaggerate it. On the other hand, look, Sarah Palin. Does anyone remember Sarah Palin now? Sarah Palin was, the John the Baptist to Trump's Antichrist, or the St. John the Baptist to Trump's Antichrist. So clearly that kind of figure can rise back up. I believe, and I will say this, I don't know if his image or his words got broadcast much into Sweden, but Pete Buttigieg, who will now be the Secretary of Transportation, was my favorite candidate. I'm in part because I like short, hyper-articulate, overeducated men. I'm not gay, but other than that, I totally over-identified with him. But he made his platform was fix the democratic deficits, and before you do anything else, give statehood to places that don't have it, fix the electoral college. And Buttigieg was very clear about, and I know this is a little bit detailed, but to expanding the Supreme Court. That's been condemned as court packing, but it's absurd. There's no reason why the Supreme Court should be so unrepresentative. And I think if we fix the democratic deficits in the first instance, then the majority of the country will be able to make its voice felt more clearly. But the thing that I've written again and again and again, and I wrote in the year-end comment for the New Yorker, which tried to sum up my views about all of these questions, is that liberal democracy is the most successful form of government mankind has ever had. I'll say that unapologetically. And it is always the most embattled and besieged form of government. It is always and perpetually under assault from the totalitarian temptations of the left and the authoritarian assertions of the right. That will always be the case. It will never alter. And the struggle to keep liberal democracies afloat is never going to go away.
No, and I think that as I have understood that you're late to your book behind you.
I do. I'm shameless. I'm a Jewish New Yorker. We always be closing, as it says in David Mamet's play. We always show our books.
Contains some recipes for the recovery of democracy. Is that so? That
Yes.
You have some tips or very practical angles of how to
yes,
help American democracy to recover?
Yes, it was one of those things where I tried to write a book that was for my daughter. It's a letter to my daughter about liberalism, this book, because my daughter was terribly traumatized. She was 17 on the night of Trump's election. And I wanted to write her a book that would be an encapsulation of my values, and even more important, an introduction to my gallery of heroes and heroines, everyone from the great Harriet Taylor to even including a figure like Emma Goldman, who's not at all liberal in any sense, but reminds us of how much liberals can learn from the left and so on. But my editor said, and you know how working journalists, you know that editors lead us by the nose, said, you have to put some positive prescriptions in here too. And the ones that I felt that I could say with some authority, I'm not a pundit, I'm not a political analyst, I can't say, what we need is light rail transport between Boston and New York. That's outside my purview. But there were three things I wanted to emphasize. One, and this may be the most important of them, is that the left, liberal left, has to reclaim the language of patriotism. It is a horrific thing to allow there was nothing more obscene than the sight of Donald Trump literally, because he's a crude man, wrapping himself in the American flag. It was wildly inappropriate, but it also was the most grotesquely visible symbol of the capacity of the authoritarian right to wrap itself in the symbols of patriotism. The former French Prime Minister Emmanuel Valls once said in the French context, we cannot surrender Marianne to the National Front, meaning the symbol of the French Republic, Marianne, the female symbol of the French Republic in the Phrygian cap, to the National Front. And I feel very strongly that we can't surrender a patriotic love of America to the right. You know, you mentioned Philip Roth before, and as I said, one of the greatest honors of my professional life was being able to go to Sweden to this institute and speak on, give Philip the Nobel Prize he had never won posthumously. And Philip was very concerned about the question of patriotism towards the end of his life, and his feeling that he had grown up as a left-wing kid in New Jersey with easy access to a language of patriotism. He grew up loving America. America had defeated fascism. America was the land of opportunity. America was imperfect, so we had to fight for civil rights and for against the right. Above all, we had to fight for civil rights. But he had easy access to patriotism, to patriotic language, in a way that he felt was vanishing. And if I can tell you a quick anecdote, because it was very moving to me, after Trump was elected, my son, who was in his 20s, who's a philosopher, a Heideggerian by studies, decided to put aside his studies and go into political organizing because it was such a moment of emergency. And he went to work for a candidate on Staten Island, liberal candidate on Staten Island, which is the most reactionary part of New York City, the only reactionary part of New York City. And he went there, and one of the things that confronted him when he took the Staten Island ferry out to the very different part of the world than he'd ever been to, was that almost everybody had an American flag on their porch or in front of their house. And almost every house of people who were very, very suspicious of liberal Democrats had somebody who had served in the army, you know, in an all-volunteer army. And he had to learn how to get in the door, how when you knocked and they opened the door and you said, "I'm here to speak for Max Rose," they didn't just slam the door in your face. And he learned, you know, to say Max Rose is an Army veteran, he's proud of his service, to say, you know, I'm in the middle of my Peace Corps work, whatever it was. He had to learn to speak a different dialect, a dialect of common patriotism. And once he'd done that, he could literally get in the door, and they won the election. And I think that we on the American left have been very absent in our ability to speak that language. Joe Biden speaks it very well. Barack Obama spoke it very well. But, you know, and it's complicated because, as I'm sure you've followed, one of the great kind of controversies in New York in the past year or 2 years has been about the 1619 Project. Has that come across to Sweden at all? The New York Times published a series of pieces saying that the true founding of the United States was not in 1776. It was in 1619 when the first slaves were brought here, and that the entire notion of America as a democratic, egalitarian, liberty-loving country is a lie, that it's been a oppressive, white supremacist, slave-owning and racist country from its very beginnings. And, you know, like as with any controversial thing, there were half-truths, significant truths that Americans have forgotten in that document. But I prefer, you know, Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, slave, leader of African-American forces and the American Civil War, I think had the right attitude. He said, the Constitution of the United States is a great liberty-loving document that has never been fulfilled. And it is our task to take its empty promises and make them whole. And I think that that's a much healthier platform for the American left to live on than the platform that says America is degenerate and has always been racist and oppressive. Even if you believe that to be true, it is a complete failure as a political project. It suggests no political project that can ever command the majority of the country.
And you're also stressing, I guess, the importance of defending the institutions of democracy.
Yes, and thank you for putting me back on.
Yeah, why is that so important?
Thank you for putting me back on track. Yes, I think that liberal institutions are obviously the most important part of liberal government, much more than even elections, important though they are. And one of the things I think that we've learned and I really mean learned from social sciences in the last 50 years, is the profound join between civil society, social trust, as it's called, social capital, as it's called, all of those non-political institutions that bring people together to work and barter and coexist with people who are not of their religious persuasion, not of their ethnic kind. That when we have those institutions of social trust, reservoirs of social capital, then democracy can be strong and can blossom. And when that social capital is expended, it doesn't matter if you have ostensible democratic institutions, they'll fail. The Russia being examples 1 through 1,000, that you can have democratic elections and you can have a democratic sounding constitution, but if you don't have social trust, if you don't have social capital, you just have kleptocracy and oligarchy. So one of the tasks, I think, for the American left, the American liberals, is to rebuild those institutions of social trust, that social capital. And if that sounds too abstract, the one thing that we know is vital to that task is education, public education. That's by far the most powerful tool of social capital that you can imagine. I say that not in an abstract way. I say because it comes right out of my own experience. Again, we talked about Philip Roth. Philip came from a first-generation immigrant background, and he got educated at an excellent public school in Newark, New Jersey. My father also came from exactly the same background, exactly the same history. His father could sort of speak English, and he went to an excellent public school in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and went on to become a professor of 18th century English literature. That the ability of public schooling, of public education, to act as a lever, a trampoline of social mobility and of social capital is, I think, essential. And the degradation of the American public education system is, I think, core to the degradation of American democracy.
It's a very, I could go on for hours, but I have to ask you, I think we're nearing the end, but I have to ask you about France and Europe and democracy. As we said in the beginning, you have just received the Légion d'honneur. And democracy is also under siege to some extent in Europe, not at least in France, where we have the chance or risk of Le Pen or a member of the family Le Pen becoming president one day. Would you say that the crisis for democracy in the United States and Europe are of the same character, the same base, or two different phenomena?
Well, they're obviously, alike and different at the same time. They're alike in as much as it's clear that the same urban and rural divide that shapes American politics in so many ways is in place in France. It is worse in France in lots of ways because France is so polarized and always has been, between Paris as a central capital and the rest of rural France. It's a complicated, ironic relationship because one of the duties of living in Paris is to idealize rural France at the same time, but rural France doesn't feel ideal. So it's similar in that way, same basic rural-urban divide, I think. One of the big differences, of course, and we see it in Macron's initiatives in the last few months, is that you genuinely have, in the Islamic presence, you have a very large minority that resists assimilation in some ways, for good or ill, but it does. And the effort of maintaining the integrity of the Islamic minority, while at the same time integrating that minority into broader French life, that's a specific challenge for France, which is very different from similar challenges for the United States. Whatever one says about the United States, and you can list a million sins and crimes, it's pretty good, the United States, still at integrating immigrants. It's almost too good at it because they abandon their immigrant identity for a broader American identity. It's not insignificant that Trump though repudiated by the country, did very well with Hispanics in the last election, did very well with the Hispanic minority because they identified with many of his causes and so on. So they're different in that sense, but the basic reality that liberal democracy in times of stress and crisis will always be under assault, I think is constant in that way. The other thing we haven't discussed, Per, and it's something that I brood on all the time, but I have not yet come to any conclusion worth sharing, but I'll share it anyway, is the role of the pandemic in all of this. We know that historians 100 years from now, when they write about this time, when they write about France, when they write about Sweden, when they write about the United States, will see the pandemic as causal in some way. They'll see it as the force that drove these political emergencies. They won't say, well, there was the pandemic on the one hand, and then the sequence of political emergencies on the other. They'll see it as part of a whole. But what that relationship is, how we ought to conceptualize it, I think still eludes us to some degree. Is the pandemic, is it sort of a form of sublimation, where because we're all living in a state of isolation and fear, we act out in ever more vivid ways? Or is it that the pandemic kind of x-rays the injustices and inequalities in the society and therefore drives us forward? Or is it as simple as that, when we have so much time on our hands, most of us, rich and poor, something has to occupy us. And one of the things that occupies us is causes, political causes and so on. Would the assault on the Capitol on January 6th have taken place in the absence of a pandemic? Would all of those people have had time to come to Washington if life had been normal and their working lives had been more normal? It's a big question. I don't know the answer, but I know that it's central to understanding this moment.
Really. And we have this, we call it right-wing populist movements, the anti-democratic movements, the anti-liberal movements, the hatred, the contempt for elites or for truth, for science, for journalists, and so forth. Do you think that there actually are a risk that they will turn into something that will finally end in really nasty kind of authoritarian rules with persecutions of large groups and so forth? Not the 30s in repeating the 30s, but something similar to it, including the persecution of large population groups of sections of the populations.
Yes, I think it's, if you want a nightmare scenario, imagine that Trump had been reelected. He never was going to get a majority of the vote, but it was not impossible for him to win the Electoral College in America. Imagine that there was a confrontation with Iran, and imagine then many Americans were killed in that confrontation. And then imagine what the fate of Muslims in the United States would have been. It's not at all difficult to create, it's easy to create a circumstance in which the world of 1940 or 1941 even, God forbid, would have been reproduced in America. I said before, I'm a disciple of John Stuart Mill, and that's certainly true. But I'm also a follower of Karl Popper, the great German British philosopher who wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies, while he was in exile, forced into exile from Austria by Hitler. And one of Popper's great themes, and for me that still is a book we should all come back to again and again, The Open Society and Its Enemies. One of his great themes is that history does not write itself, we write it. There is no plot in history. There's no inexorable line in history. That was one of Philip's themes as well. It was not inevitable that Lindbergh would be defeated, that Roosevelt would win. There are no inevitabilities in this story. The risks are enormous. It is easy to write a history of the next 10 years in which all of the worst things that we imagine can take place. But it's also not difficult to write a history in which, in the classic way that liberal democracies solve their problems, they do it by education, they do it by assimilation, they do it by compromise, they do it by the slow osmotic process of acculturation and acceptance. I'm old enough, Per, to remember when the idea of a Black president was unthinkable. unimaginable. I'm old enough to remember when the idea of equality for homosexual marriage was an absurd, remote, marginal conception. And now we have had a Black president, and the complaint is he wasn't Black enough. Now we have gay marriage as a commonplace thing. And the complaint is that we haven't been fair to the trans community sufficiently. So I deeply believe in the possibility of reform. And I believe, and let me just add quickly, and those changes, though they're not accepted by everyone, command more majoritarian support than you ever would have imagined that they could. You know, the idea of gay marriage, which 40 years ago was impossible, is now, you couldn't reverse it. You couldn't reverse it. It's become a social fact, an uncontroversial social fact of American life. So I genuinely believe, I'm the last man who believes in the power of democratic reform and in the possibility of liberal progress. And, you know, but do I believe those things are irreversible or that they have the inevitable force of history behind them? No, not at all. It all could turn around.
Thank you very much, Adam. And it was great talking to you. It could go on for a very long time, but I'll let you loose.
Well,
so thank you very much.
I know I'm the master of the 15-minute answer to the 20-second question.
It was great. So,
but please, I genuinely, I miss being in Stockholm. I miss Sweden, and I'd love to know more about the state of mind and play and pandemic in Sweden. So let's have that conversation again.
Looking forward to see you there. Great. Thank you very much again, and thank you all for watching. Bye, and thank you all for watching Jewish Culture in Sweden. And please check the site for more information: judiskultur.se, judiskultur.se. I'm Per Svensson, and I wish you all a very nice evening. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.